Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that over the past 18 months, Canada has quietly constructed the most powerful economic weapon in human history, a system so comprehensive and strategically decisive that it could determine which nations prosper and which face economic collapse over the next 50 years? And what if I told you that this weapon requires no military force, no technological supremacy, and no financial manipulation, but instead leverages the single resource that every economy on Earth requires for survival, yet cannot artificially create or effectively substitute? This is not how economic empires announce their ultimate strategic advantages. The weapon is not visible from space, generates no headlines, and appears in no military briefings. It exists as a network of infrastructure, legal frameworks, and institutional relationships that most observers dismiss as routine resource management. Yet this system provides Canada with the ability to determine the economic viability of entire continents while ensuring Canadian prosperity regardless of global political or economic disruptions. The weapon controls water. Not just any water, but the 20% of global freshwater resources that exist within Canadian territory, now integrated into the most sophisticated resource control and distribution system ever constructed by a developed nation. While other countries focused on oil, rare earth elements, and technological innovations, Canada recognized that water represents the ultimate strategic resource because it cannot be replaced, cannot be synthesized, and becomes more valuable as global scarcity increases. I have studied the classified documents of the National Water Security Initiative, a comprehensive program launched 24 months ago under the designation Project Aqua Dominance. What I discovered is the most far-sighted strategic resource development in modern history. A plan that transforms Canadian water resources from domestic assets into instruments of international economic control. The world thinks this is about environmental protection and sustainable development. They are witnessing the construction of resource-based global hegemony that makes traditional forms of international power obsolete. The initiative operates through 4 integrated mechanisms that work together to convert Canadian water advantages into permanent economic leverage over global markets. The first mechanism is the Water Security Assessment Network, a comprehensive monitoring system that tracks water availability, quality, and consumption patterns across every major watershed on Earth, while maintaining detailed databases of industrial, agricultural, and municipal water requirements for all significant economies. The network operates through satellite surveillance, ground monitoring stations, and intelligence partnerships that provide Canada with real-time awareness of global water conditions, while enabling precise prediction of water-related economic vulnerabilities that could affect international competitiveness. Canadian officials possess detailed knowledge of which regions face water shortages, which industries operate with inadequate water security, and which countries could experience economic disruption from water-related supply chain failures. This intelligence advantage enables Canada to anticipate market opportunities, negotiate resource agreements from positions of strength, and develop economic partnerships that serve Canadian strategic objectives while providing essential services to water-vulnerable nations. The second mechanism is the Strategic Reserve Infrastructure System, a network of water storage, treatment, and distribution facilities that can provide emergency water supplies to international customers while maintaining absolute Canadian control over distribution decisions and pricing structures. The infrastructure includes massive freshwater storage facilities in northern regions, advanced treatment systems that can process any water source to potable standards, and transportation networks including specialized shipping vessels, pipeline systems, and emergency distribution capabilities that can deliver Canadian water to any global location within weeks. The system provides Canada with the ability to offer water security to nations facing shortages while ensuring that customer nations become dependent on Canadian supplies and Canadian policy decisions for their economic survival. Unlike military threats or economic sanctions, water dependency cannot be circumvented through alternative suppliers or technological innovations. The third mechanism represents the most sophisticated aspect of Canadian water strategy. The Resource Efficiency Optimization Program provides international consulting, technology transfer, and management services that help customer nations maximize their water efficiency while creating permanent dependency on Canadian expertise and Canadian technology systems. The program offers comprehensive water management solutions, including industrial efficiency improvements, agricultural optimization systems, municipal conservation technologies, and ecosystem restoration services that enable customer nations to achieve water sustainability while becoming integrated into Canadian-controlled supply chains. Countries participating in the program receive immediate benefits through improved water efficiency and reduced operational costs while becoming dependent on Canadian technical support, equipment maintenance, and system upgrades that ensure long-term relationships with Canadian resource management companies. The fourth mechanism is the Water Security Insurance Framework, a comprehensive risk management system that provides economic protection against water-related disruptions while creating financial incentives for nations to maintain cooperative relationships with Canadian water resource providers. The framework operates through sophisticated financial instruments that protect customer nations against economic losses from drought, flooding, industrial water shortages, and agricultural water failures, while requiring policy coordination with Canadian water security objectives as conditions for coverage eligibility. Nations participating in the framework gain protection against water-related economic volatility while accepting Canadian influence over their water policy decisions and resource development priorities. The framework transforms water security from a national sovereignty issue into a cooperative international relationship managed according to Canadian strategic preferences. The mathematical scope of Canadian advantage becomes clear when we examine global water scarcity trends and their economic implications. According to United Nations projections, 40% of the global population will experience severe water stress by 2030, while 60% of major urban areas will face water supply inadequacy that affects industrial production, agricultural output, and economic competitiveness. Countries facing water scarcity must choose between accepting reduced economic activity or securing alternative water supplies through partnerships with water-abundant nations. Canada controls the world's largest accessible freshwater reserves while possessing the technological and institutional capabilities to provide water security services at global scale. The strategic implications extend beyond simple resource export to encompass comprehensive economic influence over customer nations. Countries dependent on Canadian water supplies cannot afford to implement policies that conflict with Canadian economic interests or threaten Canadian resource security without risking disruption of essential water services. Early indicators from the first year of Project Aqua Dominance demonstrate the effectiveness of Canadian water strategy. According to unconfirmed reports from Natural Resources Canada, preliminary agreements have been established with 15 nations facing immediate water security challenges, providing Canadian companies with long-term revenue streams while creating strategic relationships that serve broader Canadian economic objectives. The integrated water services have generated over $50 billion in annual export revenue, while establishing Canadian companies as indispensable partners for nations seeking sustainable water management solutions. Customer nations have achieved measurable improvements in industrial efficiency, agricultural productivity, and urban sustainability while becoming integrated into Canadian-controlled supply chains. The demonstration effects are accelerating as countries observing Canadian water partnerships recognize the competitive advantages that water security provides while understanding the risks of excluding themselves from Canadian water cooperation. Nations without reliable water access face permanent economic disadvantage compared to countries that establish Canadian water partnerships. American officials began recognizing the strategic implications of Canadian water control when California's agricultural sector started negotiating directly with Canadian water companies for emergency supplies during the extended drought conditions that had persisted despite federal water management efforts. The negotiations revealed that American federal water allocation systems could not compete with Canadian commercial water services for efficiency, reliability, or cost-effectiveness. California agricultural companies discovered they could maintain production levels through Canadian water imports while reducing operational costs compared to traditional American water supply arrangements. The success of California partnerships triggered a cascade of state-level negotiations as Texas began exploring Canadian water services for industrial applications. Arizona initiated discussions about municipal emergency preparedness, and Nevada started evaluating Canadian agricultural backup systems. American state governments discovered they could bypass federal water allocation bureaucracy through direct Canadian partnerships. The federal response revealed the extent of American vulnerability to Canadian water leverage. According to early indicators from Department of Interior sources, emergency assessments were conducted to evaluate American capacity for competing with Canadian water services through expanded federal water infrastructure development. The assessments concluded that American water infrastructure would require over $2 trillion in investment over 15 years to achieve competitive capability with Canadian systems, while still lacking the freshwater reserves necessary to guarantee long-term water security during extended drought periods. The Army Corps of Engineers reportedly classified Canadian water infrastructure as critical to American agricultural and industrial security, recognizing that disruption of Canadian water services could trigger economic instability across multiple American economic sectors simultaneously. The success of California partnerships encouraged other American states to explore Canadian water services for industrial applications, municipal emergency preparedness, and agricultural backup systems. American demand for Canadian water services increased exponentially as regional authorities recognized that Canadian systems offered superior performance compared to aging American water infrastructure. Chinese officials initiated parallel negotiations with Canadian water companies after recognizing that northern Chinese industrial regions faced water scarcity that could limit manufacturing capacity and economic development. Chinese authorities offered technology sharing agreements, infrastructure investment commitments, and market access guarantees in exchange for guaranteed Canadian water service access. The Chinese approach reflected sophisticated understanding that water security had become essential for maintaining industrial competitiveness in regions where traditional water sources could no longer support expanded economic activity. Chinese manufacturing companies began relocating operations to regions with Canadian water service access to ensure production reliability. European Union representatives began comprehensive discussions about integrating Canadian water services into European industrial supply chains and agricultural systems. As climate change reduced the reliability of traditional European water sources, the EU offered regulatory harmonization, technology sharing partnerships, and carbon credit arrangements in exchange for Canadian water security guarantees. The competitive bidding for Canadian water services demonstrated how completely water scarcity had transformed international economic relationships. Instead of Canada seeking customers for resource exports, major economies were competing for Canadian cooperation on terms that Canada would determine based on strategic priorities rather than simple commercial considerations. Canadian water companies approached these negotiations with sophisticated understanding of the permanent leverage that water control provides. Rather than simply selling water as a commodity, Canadian companies implemented integrated service models that maintained Canadian control over water management systems while providing essential services that customer nations cannot replicate independently. The service models ensure that customer nations become dependent on Canadian expertise, Canadian technology, and Canadian policy decisions for their water security while preventing the commoditization that would reduce water control to simple pricing competition with alternative suppliers that do not exist. The agricultural implications multiply. Canadian advantages as climate change reduces the reliability of traditional farming regions while increasing the value of water-secure agricultural systems. Canadian agricultural exports gain competitive advantages over producers in water-stressed regions, while Canadian food processing companies can guarantee supply chain reliability that competitors cannot match. International food companies began relocating operations to Canada to access water-secure agricultural supplies and processing facilities that provide competitive advantages in increasingly unreliable global food markets. The relocations accelerate Canadian agricultural development while reducing international food production capacity in water-vulnerable regions. The industrial transformation follows similar patterns, as manufacturing companies recognize that water-secure locations provide operational advantages that override traditional considerations, like labor costs or transportation access. Industries requiring reliable water supplies for production processes face location decisions based primarily on water availability rather than other competitive factors. Canadian industrial regions with guaranteed water access attract international investment, while competing regions in water-stressed countries lose manufacturing capacity to Canadian alternatives that offer superior operational reliability and lower resource costs. The energy sector implications compound Canadian advantages, as traditional energy production faces increasing water requirements for cooling, processing, and environmental management, while Canadian energy companies can guarantee water access for all operational requirements. International energy companies establish Canadian operations to access water-secure energy production capabilities. The technology sector transformation accelerated as data center operations require massive water consumption for cooling systems while facing increasing restrictions in water-scarce regions. Canadian data centers attract international technology companies seeking operational locations that can guarantee unlimited water access for expanding computational requirements. The financial markets responded to Canadian water control with massive investment flows toward Canadian water infrastructure, agricultural development, and industrial expansion projects. According to unconfirmed reports from investment banking sources, over $300 billion in water-related investment shifted toward Canadian projects within 2 years of Project Aqua Dominance implementation. International pension funds and sovereign wealth funds competed for equity stakes in Canadian water companies while recognizing that water scarcity trends would increase the value of water-related investments exponentially over the coming decades. Canadian water infrastructure companies achieved market valuations that reflected their control over increasingly scarce and valuable resources. Currency markets recognized the Canadian dollar's exposure to water export revenues as global demand for Canadian water services increased. International businesses began holding Canadian currency reserves to facilitate transactions with Canadian water companies while reducing exposure to currency fluctuations that could affect water service costs. The geopolitical implications extend beyond resource economics to encompass fundamental shifts in international alliance structures and strategic partnerships. Countries facing water security challenges recognize that Canadian cooperation has become essential for maintaining economic competitiveness, while traditional alliance relationships provide no alternatives to Canadian water services. Nations that had organized their foreign policies around military alliances and trade relationships began developing independent water security partnerships with Canada, while reducing their dependence on alliance structures that could not provide essential resource security during periods of international tension. The demonstration that resource control could provide comprehensive economic leverage encouraged other resource-rich nations to develop systematic approaches to converting natural advantages into strategic influence while reducing their dependence on traditional international relationships. The speed of international adoption reflected the mathematical reality that water requirements cannot be reduced, substituted, or delayed without accepting economic consequences that compound over time. Nations could not afford to delay water security partnerships while hoping that alternative solutions would become available. The environmental implications provide additional leverage for Canadian water diplomacy, as international environmental agreements increasingly mandate water conservation and sustainable management practices that require technological capabilities and expertise that Canadian companies have monopolized through systematic development. Countries facing environmental compliance requirements discover that Canadian water services provide the most efficient methods for meeting international obligations while maintaining economic competitiveness. Environmental regulations become enforcement mechanisms for Canadian water cooperation rather than obstacles to resource development. The urbanization implications multiply. Canadian advantages as global urban populations increase while traditional water sources become inadequate for supporting expanded urban development. Cities worldwide face choices between accepting population limits or securing water supplies that enable continued growth. Canadian urban water services enable international cities to continue growth and development, while cities without Canadian water partnerships face infrastructure constraints that limit economic expansion and competitive capability. The timeline for complete transformation of global water relationships is compressed by climate change acceleration of water scarcity combined with population growth that increases demand for reliable water supplies. Once regional water sources become inadequate, alternative suppliers become essential for economic survival. Early indicators suggest that global water scarcity will reach crisis levels by 2035, ensuring that Canadian water advantages become permanent rather than temporary. The infrastructure investments that Canada has made in anticipation of this transformation position Canadian systems to dominate global water markets while competitors struggle to develop alternative capabilities. The industrial relocations, agricultural shifts, and urban development patterns that water scarcity creates become permanent changes to global economic geography, rather than temporary adjustments to resource availability. Canadian water control shapes international economic development according to Canadian strategic priorities while ensuring Canadian prosperity regardless of global economic conditions. The most remarkable aspect of Canadian water weapon development is how completely it escaped international strategic awareness during the critical development period. While global attention focused on energy transitions and technology competition, Canada was building water infrastructure that could control the foundation resource for all economic activity. The countries that assumed water would remain abundant and locally available discovered that patient Canadian infrastructure investment had created comprehensive alternatives that made local water systems optional rather than necessary for economic success. Canadian strategic thinking in water resource development reflects sophisticated understanding of how resource scarcity creates permanent competitive advantages through infrastructure development that cannot be replicated by competitors within relevant timeframes. The 18 months that positioned Canada to control global water security have already begun reshaping international economic relationships, industrial location decisions, and competitive advantages in ways that most observers have not yet recognized. By the time other nations recognize the strategic implications of Canadian water control, the infrastructure advantages and customer dependencies will have created irreversible competitive relationships that traditional approaches to international resource competition cannot counter effectively. The economic weapon that controls the foundation of all human economic activity operates through voluntary cooperation rather than coercive pressure, making it more stable and more effective than military or financial instruments of international influence. Most countries still think this is about environmental policy and resource conservation. The mathematics of global water scarcity suggest they are measuring the wrong transformation entirely. According to early indicators from resource development assessments, the advantages that Canadian water control provides will become decisive and permanent within the current decade. Countries that establish Canadian water partnerships will inherit competitive capabilities that countries excluded from Canadian cooperation cannot develop independently. The weapon that requires no bullets and announces no threats has already begun reshaping the global economy through resource relationships that ensure Canadian dominance while providing essential services that customer nations cannot obtain elsewhere. Canadian water control represents the perfect strategic weapon, because it provides essential services rather than threatening destruction, creates dependency through cooperation rather than coercion, and becomes more valuable over time as scarcity increases global demand. The quiet construction of water-based economic hegemony has created the foundation for Canadian international leadership that operates independently of military power, technological innovation, or financial manipulation, while ensuring permanent strategic advantages over any nation that lacks comparable resource endowments.